In this video, we're going to build off of our introduction video, this RackForms JavaScript Quick Start, and we're going to talk a little bit more about how we apply some of these techniques to RackForms itself. So you can hop over to RackForms here, and essentially what I have here is a screenshot of a job that we wanted to then reproduce in RackForms. So I had kind of like a select item, and then we want to drive the visibility of these three select items based on this first one. And so this is what the job looks like in RackForms. I have option 1 selected, and I show the option 1 box. If I select option 2, I show option 2, and so on and so forth. So how do we create something like this in RackForms? Well, we use conditional processing, though we have to use custom conditional processing. And so the reason why this falls under the preview of the JavaScript video as a follow-up is we do have some custom coding in here. Now, if I just wanted to show and hide single fields, RackForms makes that really easy with the boxes that we have on the top half of the screen right here. So we can select comparisons, actions, show, hide, delete, enable, etc., and then which fields we want to show and hide, or entire wrapper classes. It's really easy to do single fields, but as soon as we have multiple fields, we do need to use custom coding. So the custom coding that we have, we can see right here. We have a bunch of comments right here. Let me just delete these. We first step in and we hide all of the fields, and then we use a switch statement in JavaScript to essentially look at the value that we've passed in, and then use a show field statement to show each one of these items based on which option it was. So in this case, it's option 1, 2, or 3, and so that's what we show. So that's what the job does. Let's recreate this job now so you can see exactly how it's done. So I'm going to create a new job here, and we'll call this demo.js. I'm going to create an input page, and just as we saw a few seconds ago, I'm going to create 4 select items. The first one is going to be, I'm going to call this tester. I'm going to say select a value to show that box. And then for these 3 guys, then the first task that I have to do is I have to give these guys a unique ID of some sort. And these unique IDs are really important because, as we learned in the first video, that's how we select things in JavaScript, is by their ID. And so for select 1, 2, and 3, I'm going to change its name to select 1, select 2, and select 3. So I change the label, and then I'm going to change its ID / name value right here. So I'm going to say option 1, option 2, and then option 3. Now we have to set the values of our select box so that they make sense for these options that we're selecting. So to do that, I'm going to scroll down to its item options, and I'm simply going to add option 1, option 2, and option 3. Finally, I should probably go in and hide these guys so that when we first load the page, they're not showing at all. And to do that, I'm going to select the item and go under conditional processing and just uncheck field initially visible for each one of these. So what have we done so far? Well, we've essentially just set up a series of values for items so therefore make sense. The first is I've changed the labels so that our user would be able to understand what these values are. So here this is tester, and then select 1, 2, and 3. As a matter of fact, let's actually change this, and I think about it to option 1, 2, and 3, just so this makes a little bit more sense. So we've changed the labels. Then I went ahead and I changed the name values for each one of these guys to make sense for what the box does. So for option 1, I've called this option 1, option 2, and option 3. And of course, this would be any value that makes sense for whatever you're doing. So it could be year, make, and model for doing cars. It could be construction materials for a construction form, etc. Finally, I went in, and because these guys need to be hidden when we first load the page, because we want to toggle them on using this box right here, I went ahead and I unchecked field initially visible from each one of these. So now when I build the form, I get something like this. I get a select item that when I select the option, it doesn't actually do anything yet. Now at the most basic level, I could change that by selecting our top box right here, and under conditional processing, selecting an event, in this case on change. That's the event that text boxes, or excuse me, select items use. And then I'm going to say if the field is equal to some value, I'm going to show one of our boxes. So if it's equal to option 1, then I'm going to show option 1. And you'll notice now that when I run this form, that's exactly what we get. We get option 1 shown. And because we have the easy toggle box checked, that is this guy right here, we actually toggle it on when I select the different values. Now again, the problem with this is this doesn't work for more than one value, right? So we can only check one value right here, option 1. So because of that, we actually need to write our custom code. So let me clear off these values just to kind of restart from the beginning here. So the one thing that we do keep in RackForms is the event trigger, right? So you may recall once again from our first video, JavaScript always is going to be kicked off by some type of event. In this case, our event is on change because that is what select items do. If we had a text box, we probably want to be doing something like on key up, because you're typing a value, and every time that key comes up, you want to trigger some event. Similarly, you might want to use on blur. So you type an entire value, and then when you leave that field, you blur it. That's when you trigger the event. But in this case, because we're using a select item, that's what we want to use is on change. The code that we want to use then, and we've got actually a nice shortcut for that, can simply be found right here under common radio item switch code. Now I should actually mention this value may be changed for the next build of RackForms because this actually can be used for more than just radio items. As you're about to see, it can also be used for select items as well. So what's nice about this though is instead of having to write code in here, all I'm going to do is I'm just going to click to add this code to our custom conditional field statement. So now we have to change this code in a few specific areas so that it works for our particular form. So to do that, I'm going to click on the advanced editor right here. And once again, just to clear things up, I'm actually going to get rid of all these comments. Of course, if you're using this for the first time, make sure you read through these comments as they include a few really important notes about how this code works. But for our case, I'm just going to delete this just so we can keep this a little bit cleaner. So the first step that we perform is we're going to hide all fields. So this code is going to be run whenever we fire off our event. And as we recall here, our event is on change. So anytime we change the value here, this code is going to run. And so to make our logic as clean as possible, we're simply going to issue the hide field command to each one of these guys that could potentially show. If I had 4 text boxes, or 4 select items in this case, I would simply add another one of these hide field commands, right? And I'd call it like text4. Now in this case, as you may recall, these guys actually have a slightly different name. So their name / value is option 1, right? Option 2 and option 3. So that's actually what we want to change this to right now. So we're going to hide option 1, option 2, and option 3. So when we first kick off this code from an on-change event, we're going to hide option 1, option 2, option 3. Then we're going to show the appropriate one. And we do that with the switch statement. And the switch statement gets as its value here in value. And in underscore value here then is going to check the 3 options that we potentially have. Now as you may recall, the options that we have are indeed option 1, 2, and 3. And so the cases that we're looking for, that is the value that we're going to try to find, is option 1, option 2, and option 3. So what's nice about this code is I don't even need to change anything for it. However, if our values were different, if this was Chevrolet and Ford, then the cases I'd be looking for would be those values. So I would say Ford in here, for example. This is, in other words, this case right here is the value that our select item is currently selected with. We then issue the opposite of this hide field command. We issue show field. And then the show field essentially needs the same change that we did right here. So which field do we want to show? Well, in this case, it defaults to text 1, 2, and 3, but we want to say option 1, option 2, and option 3. So I'll just change that value right there. Finally, the reason why I mentioned that this code may actually be changing is right now this code is set up to actually use an animation. But in order to use animations, we have to include a JavaScript library in our code. And we don't actually have that. So we can actually leave this blank, and that'll take away our animation. So in this case, I would change that. I think that RackForms is going to be updated, so this is just the default. So you won't have to do this step a couple weeks down the road. That is January 2014. But for right now, if you're using this, or if you're using earlier build, you want to remove that value. But now we're essentially set up. We hide all the fields when an event is triggered, and then based on which option has been selected, option 1, 2, or 3, we're then going to show the field option 1, 2, or 3. And we can actually then save and preview this just to make sure that everything works. So there's option 1, option 2, and option 3. So finally, in closing, I should mention that there are other ways that we can do this type of logic as well. So here we're using JavaScript to do this, though that's not to say that's the correct way of doing it. It may actually be that we would want to create separate pages for each one of these options. So we would want to go ahead and take this value, and instead of using JavaScript to do this, I would create a conditional statement for our submit button. And I'd say if option 1 is selected, then go to a page called option 1, for example. And that may actually be a smarter way of doing this for them. So it's one of the tricks, of course, of doing this type of logic is what is the appropriate way of doing it. But most of the time, JavaScript is the right answer. And by using these conditional code statements right here, we can get really complex when we need to create exactly the type of logic that we need.